Well, I did my series on the First Seminole War, and so what comes afterwards? Soon after, you have the Adams-Onis Treaty, which Spain cedes Florida over to the United States, and Andrew Jackson becomes the first American governor of Florida. So we have the changeover of flags commemoration last month in July 2021. And so behind me is like a painting of it in St. Augustine. Anyway, somebody at the commemoration asked me if the Indians have part of it or if the Seminoles or if they were there. So it's a good question. So I dove into the papers and articles and things from that period. So most of the material I use is from this book right here. Over 1,100 pages. It's the Territorial Papers of Florida, Territorial Papers of the United States, Volume 22, Florida Territory, 1821 to 1824. So this took me all day, even though I only really went into the first 350 pages of Jackson's administration. It was only about 5 or 6 months long, or his commission was about 9 months. And I also went into the American State Papers, which have 110 pages devoted to the papers of the administration of Andrew Jackson. That's American State Papers Miscellaneous, Volume 10, pages 799 to 912. And this was kind of an unusual find because you'd expect the American State Papers, they have Secretary of State and they have Indian Affairs, or Secretary of War, but where I found this about the Florida Governor Papers and Miscellaneous, just a total part. And it was a benefit because the Territorial Papers does not have everything in there, like the Miscellaneous Papers had a letter, kind of the minutes of the meeting between the Seminole Indians and Edmund Wanton. Sometimes you have to research in some interesting places. Anyway, the Army was downsized after the War of 1812. Regiments were combined. Officer positions were eliminated. Major General Jacob Brown became the commanding general of the Army. Major General Andrew Jackson's position was eliminated because he was the junior officer, or the general officer in the Army. He was actually started out in the War of 1812 as head of the Tennessee militia, and in the middle of the war he was commissioned as a major general in the Army. And so Andrew Jackson's position was terminated by act of Congress, and he was given an honorable discharge effective June 1st, 1821. Jackson is still called General as a title the rest of his life. And it's even on his tombstone, even though he was a president, that does not appear on the tombstone. It just says General Andrew Jackson. At the same time, the Army being downsized, Colonel William King, who of course was in Pensacola and in some controversial incidents there where he hanged as a deserter, or maybe he shot him, I can't remember which. Fort King's named after him. He was also terminated from the Army and given an honorable discharge on June 1st. And he went up, as soon as that happened, he went up to Sackett's Harbor, New York, and eventually became the post sutler at Fort Niagara. You don't see him on any of the transfer flags. The United States had negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty, deciding the border between the United States and Spain. The US agreed not to bother with Texas, but that would only last 17 years until 1836. Spain ceded over to the United States the remaining Floridas, and the part of Florida that hadn't already been taken over by the United States, which in 1811 occupied Mobile and that part of West Florida, saying that there's too much you know, too much unauthority or a lot of things going on under no authority and no law enforcement. So the United States decided to just help out and step in and take over. And that was Mobile. A lot of people don't realize that the United States pretty much just walked in and took over, and that became part of Mississippi territory. Jackson was appointed the commissioner and governor of Florida to work with the transfer of Florida to the United States. As commissioner and governor, Jackson now answers to the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who also negotiated the treaty, Adams-Onis Treaty. Once the flag transfer is complete, the title of commissioner is completed, so that title's dropped, and Andrew Jackson's just the governor of Florida. His position would be similar to the governors of Louisiana in 1803 after the Louisiana Purchase, and also the governor of Mississippi at the same time, Mississippi Territory. Louisiana became a U.S. territory in 1803 and became a state in 1812. And John Quincy Adams sent Andrew Jackson a copy of all the laws and the acts of Louisiana Territory, and the first Louisiana governor saying, just make this as your guidelines for, what you're supposed to, what your job description is or what you're supposed to do. It's kind of humorous when you think that Andrew Jackson in New Orleans in 1814, when the British were approaching, took over as a military occupational commander in New Orleans, locked the doors on the legislature and refused them to meet, and even threw a judge in jail. So, Jackson's given a copy of these same territorial laws, which he pretty much ignored when he came through, right before the Battle of New Orleans. So the organization and powers of Andrew Jackson are slightly different from a regular governor. People call him military governor, but I disagree because his military tenure had ended. He had been discharged to the military, and even though he's still working with the military, he's not a military officer. And Andrew Jackson's job as governor was establish the territorial courts, set up collecting taxes and customs and other governmental functions. A lot of the people Jackson requested put in place as government officials. The United States government did not do that. Instead, they put in other people, which Jackson was mad he didn't get everyone that he wanted. But, he's just going to have to live with that. Commission also stated that Jackson had the same powers as the previous Spanish governor in St. Augustine. So, it's kind of ambiguous what his powers were, what his jobs were. President Monroe said that Andrew Jackson's appointment as governor was that smugglers and slave traders would hide their heads, pirates will disappear, and the Seminoles will cease to cause trouble. Not in these letters, but I think another reason why Andrew Jackson was appointed Florida governor is that he may be called upon to suddenly organize the militia and, quiet down trouble that might happen. And he was certainly the person who could do that, as was shown during the War of 1812 when he raised the army from Tennessee. And as territorial governor, Andrew Jackson is also Indian agent of Florida, which Indian agent was under the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. So, Jackson reports to two different people, Secretary of War and the Secretary of State. All the main territorial papers dealing with transfer, not much is said about the Florida Indians. They're not considered parties in the transfer, and they have no part in the transfer ceremony. So they may have been hanging around St. Augustine and watching it happen, but of course they were not part of that ceremony. Jackson will receive Pensacola from the Spanish governor there. Pensacola's capital of West Florida, and he received that from Spain on July 17th, 1821. Of course, Jackson's no stranger to the city, having taken it over twice in 1814 and 1818. Jackson says nearly all the public or government buildings in Pensacola are crumbling, dilapidated, and filthy. That's his words, he calls them filthy. A week before, Jackson's adjutant general, Colonel Robert Butler, who was also raised by Andrew Jackson, will receive St. Augustine in East Florida from the governor of East Florida. But first, Butler is appointed to head of the 4th Infantry Regiment, which will be stationed in Florida. Jackson wanted General Edmund Gaines to receive East Florida, but Gaines has military duties in Savannah that prevented him from doing it. So Colonel Robert Butler took charge briefly in St. Augustine. Butler arrives in St. Augustine for the transfer. On June 6, 1821, he writes to the Secretary of State saying, "The Indians are frequent here, parading the streets in drunken, riotous manner." So he doesn't have a very strong opinion of the Indians. Of course, Robert Butler was with Jackson through the Creek War and at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. After the transfer of East Florida in St. Augustine on July 10th, 1821, Colonel Butler leaves town after that, and the next officer in charge is Captain John Bell. He's put in charge, I think he later became Secretary of War. Bell says that he has to issue rations to Seminole Indians to come to him who are in a wretched state. The natives tell that Creek Chief William McIntosh has raided Seminoles and taken off with a considerable number of their Negroes and some of the Indians. So William McIntosh is acting on his own, just coming down and raiding the Seminoles and taking away the Black Seminoles. It says from the papers here that said to be 200 Seminoles in Tampa with 120 Negroes after the destruction of 4 settlements. What is not said is that was the settlement of Angola. One of the first things that Andrew Jackson did as Florida governor was to have the Marines go down there and destroy Angola. And of course, nobody ever talks about that. And broke up that free community of Black citizens, Black Seminoles. After Jackson had destroyed Old Town in 1818, 3 years earlier, they went down and established the settlement of Angola, or there may have been some of that settlement already there. And so now, 3 years later, it's destroyed by the Marines. One of Jackson's duties as Indian agent, President Monroe appoints the sub-agent of the Indians, and show you how incompetent the government is on their relation to Indians. They appoint a Frenchman that they bring in, Mr. Jean Paniers. He was a Frenchman who fled France after the downfall of Napoleon. Mr. Paniers was picked as a sub-agent because he had traded with the Indians out in Arkansas, and they said, well, he's familiar with the Indians, and the Indians just love these Frenchmen. So speaks no English, apparently, doesn't speak the Seminole language, supposedly familiar with Spanish, and they pick him because he needed a job, and they thought the Indians loved Frenchmen there. So they want Mr. Jean Paniers to find out how many Indians are in Florida, where they live, what land they claim, and what land cessions were made by them to the British or the Spanish. So the government knows nothing about the Florida Indians, and they appoint this guy who doesn't speak the Seminole language and doesn't know anything about the Indians either. So they could have appointed several other people for that job, but they don't. Um, to show how unconcerned the government was with Indians in Florida, Captain Bell in St. Augustine is unaware of the appointment of Mr. Panniers as subagent. When Bell does find out about the appointment, he says Panniers is useless, as would be any foreigner who is totally unacquainted with the Indians and the United States policy towards them. So, of course, the commander in St. Augustine doesn't even know this guy's been appointed subagent. He said, yeah, there's a French guy in Piccada claiming to be agent of the government, but nobody's told me anything. Nothing's communicated. Jackson was of the opinion, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Hawkins, that the Indians need to embrace an agricultural life, a pastoral life, quit all that hunting and gathering and stuff. I think it's important really to understand this in order to make sense of who Jackson was and his relationship with the Native Americans. This is important because the Jefferson idea that is espoused here is prominent in American policy towards the Indians, maybe even 200 years later, that the government wants the Indians to become farmers and to renounce their culture and just become like every other Americans, just totally ignoring who they are. Jackson believes that the Florida Indians had no claim on the land and that the Indians needed to be removed to the Creek Nation in Georgia. He believed that the Indians had reestablished the settlements, Miccosukee Town and also Old Town, but that was not exactly true. I'll point out right here is that there was more Indians or Seminoles, Miccosukees, Black Seminoles in Florida than the Americans or even the Spanish ever were. The Miccosukee town was bigger than both St. Augustine and Pensacola combined. Of course, the Georgians didn't want Florida Indians sent back to Georgia because they were trying to extinguish the Creek titles to the land in Georgia, and that would be much more difficult for them if suddenly a few thousand Indians moved up there. Jackson said if the Indians can't be removed, we'll concentrate them in one location, and they decided along the Apalachicola River would be a good place to do that. Jackson's still after Chief Peter McQueen, who he believes is hiding in Miccosukee Town, and he wants him returned to the Creek Nation in Georgia. He said, surely Georgia could not complain there. As long as they are permitted to remain in the Floridas, it'll be a receptacle of rogues, murderers, and runaway Negroes. That's Jackson's quote. Of course, the Georgians certainly complained and didn't want them back up there. In September 1821, Jackson received word from Captain Bell in St. Augustine that Edmund Wotton, who established the settlement of Micanopy and a trading post with the Indians, and Horatio Dexter, who was a large plantation owner on the St. Johns, down near where Blue Springs is today. Lake Beresford has plantation around there. Wotton and Dexter met with Chief Micanopy and 54 principal Indians to hear about their concerns of the transfer of Florida. Now, it's important to note that this was twice as many principal men that signed the Treaty of Moultrie Creek 2 years later. So you have the bulk of the Seminole Nation represented quite a lot that had this meeting with Edmund Wotton and Horatio Dexter. Papers don't say where the meeting was. Maybe it was at Ed Wotton's store in Micanopy. I don't know. Jackson's furious at this because Wotton and Dexter were not authorized to talk with Indians, and says that they impressed upon the minds of the Indians of their absolute right to this country, which Jackson does not recognize. He says a right to country would impede settlement to white settlers and prevent statehoods. So Jackson orders Wanton and Dexter arrested immediately. So first thing, he sends this French guy who doesn't know anything about the Seminoles to be agent, and these two settlers here who are already in Florida having peaceful negotiations with the Indians. Jackson wants them arrested. I don't think he actually arrests them because they're still writing letters. Jackson says that previous treaties didn't work out and didn't benefit anyone as far as he was concerned. He said the Indians just need to be removed to the Creek Nation where they can be protected and made happy by the bounty and humanity of the government. Imagine that. So anyway, we'll hear what the Indians had to say in a minute here. Ed Wanton and Horatio Dexter sent a letter to St. Augustine to Captain Bell to explain their talk that they had with the Indians. It says they confirmed with the Indians that the King of Spain had in fact sold the land to the United States. The president accepted the title of all the lands and was probably unaware of the Indians' rights to the lands. Yeah, I don't think the president was unaware there. Said the Indians should meet with the president and make a treaty and inform him of their rights that were given to them by the British and the Spanish. And so they're referring to the Treaty of Piccada in 1765 with the English. It says the Americans have purchased here Negroes and cattle and have no right to them. The Indians make it clear that they do not want to dispose of their country. They don't want to move, and nor do they want to be placed among strange tribes who may injure them. So already the Seminoles have heard about this removal, and whether it's to Creek Country or somewhere else, and they don't want any bit of it right now. And that's what their opinion is, and they're pretty adamant on that. And they'll stick to that, as we'll see 20 years later. The talk was made with Micanopy and 54 principal Indians on 24th of May, 1821. So this is actually before the transfer of Florida over to the United States happened after the change of flags. Indian agent Mr. Peronese went to Havana to see what treaty the Spanish made with the Indians. Jackson's furious at that because he said that, well, he had no authority to do that. Jackson doesn't care what agreement was made with the Spanish. And he says he'll give the Indians every justice which they're entitled, which I'm sure you don't believe that. You know, if you do, I have a bridge in Brooklyn Bridge to sell you. Yeah, of course, Mr. Peronese didn't speak English, so Jackson wants an interpreter to translate between things that speaks English, French, Spanish, and the Seminole language. And there actually is a person that has all that, and that's Doyle Hambly, who was one of the witnesses on the trial of Ambrister and Arbuthnot. Former employee Panton and Leslie traded with the Indians. Of course, he's unavailable. He's employed with the Creek agent at the moment. So they get another guy to negotiate, Mr. Stephen Richards, to be the translator of the Indians. And he'll eventually be removed from that post because it's found that he's negotiating things in his favor, you know, getting a land grant by the treaty and things like that. Jackson also says treaties are useless. The government just had to negotiate with the Indians previously because the government was not strong enough to enforce its own Indian policy. And I guess we can guess what that is. Jackson ordered Wanton and Dexter seized and removed from Florida. Any self-created Indian agents or treaty makers who you may find, is his orders they gave to Captain Bell. So, nothing's going very smoothly in Florida, and no negotiation is looked at as an option by Jackson. In September 17th, 1821, Jackson met with three of the chiefs that came to him, Neamathla, Mulatto King, and John Blunt, and says they came out of the treaty. They rejoice that a place will be set aside for them where they'll be protected on the Apalachicola River. Of course, they're already near this. Then Jackson says, it's absurd entering in a treaty with Indians who don't have title to the land or a claim, that they'll get no benefit. It'll also be an obstacle for surveying the land for the sale. But Jackson believes that if he can't remove the Indians to Creek country, then concentrate them in one spot, and decides that will be the Apalachicola River. Jackson doesn't believe in the legitimacy of the Arredondo Grant, where Wanton established his settlement, Micanopy, and the trading post with the Indians. Of course, that will be argued in the American courts long after Jackson's gone, after Jackson's died. In fact, you look on modern maps around Gainesville, Paynes Prairie, you can see Arredondo Grant on the modern maps. It's still there, at least on paper. 28th September 1821, letter from the Secretary of War to Captain Bell. The Secretary recognizes that the Seminole Indians have been most shamefully imposed and barbarously treated, both by the Creek Indians, of course, under McIntosh, and unprincipled individuals. Well, I'm glad that somebody recognizes that. Secretary recognizes the bad treatment of the Indians and that McIntosh raided them. But then Secretary of War, this John C. Calhoun, he says that if any slaves take shelter among the Indians, that the Seminoles must give them up. He says that many of the slaves taken by the Creeks and the Seminoles are actually slaves that have run away from the white men, and they must be returned instead. Jackson says that old Red Sticks must return to the upper creeks. McQueen and Francis's clans must go to their old country. Of course, McQueen's group includes Osceola and his family. Jackson, after that, pretty much, I think it's November 1820 run, he returns to the Hermitage in Nashville, and Jackson will never come back to Florida. But he will, of course, later on be present and still be causing trouble with the Seminoles. He leaves in charge. Behind him, acting governor William Worthington, acting governor of East Florida, and acting governor of West Florida is George Walton, who's a well-known name in Walton County, of course. Acting Governor William Worth on October 9th writes of the death of Subagent Jean Penneries, say he died suddenly of yellow fever. He is at his home, came to his home one day, he was fine. 2 days later, he dropped dead from yellow fever. And so, suddenly happened, accomplishing nothing. Says that the papers he left behind as subagent are just disorganized and shuffled about and not any good. So it's several months as subagent were, totally useless. Captain Peter Pelham is appointed subagent to replace him, and Captain Bell is appointed as Indian agent, the position Jackson had, or the title Jackson had, relieving the duties from the acting governor Worthington. So the subagent, Peter Pelham, he'll get sick and leave Florida, so he won't be much effective either. Captain Bell leaves Florida in October 1821. The military officer Moving in is Colonel Abraham Eustis. He'll be known in the Second Seminole War. Dexter and Wotton tell Eustis that their relations with Indians would be improved if a treaty can be made with them soon. That'll happen 2 years later, Treaty of Moultrie Creek. And the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, of course, agrees with Jackson about treaties being useless and that they need to be removed to Creek territory, and that Wotton and Dexter should be removed from Florida. Andrew Jackson's governor, and I just covered, was his relations with the Florida Indians. It officially ended on December 31st, 1821. George Walton, acting governor of West Florida, William Worthington, acting governor of East Florida. East and West Florida would be combined in one territory, the Territory of Florida, in 1822. In April of 1822, the next territorial governor is William P. Duval. He'll be appointed by territorial governor as by President Monroe, a post that he will hold for 12 years and will be the longest acting governor of Florida. And he had much to do with negotiating with the Seminoles and the Indians directly, including the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. So that's it for now. I hope this was very informative for you.